So I guess to start, I'll just have each of the panelists introduce themselves and their work relating to either museum studies or library science.
Hi, my name is Giselle Lydia Salgado. My pronouns are they, them, and I come from Chicago to start us off. I have a BA in Peace and Global Studies as well as Spanish and Hispanic Studies, and here I am at UNM for my Master's in Latin American Studies. And during this experience, I've been working in the Center for Southwest Research as a graduate fellow. And last year, my presentation that I was able to do at the colloquium was about modernity in the Plutarco Elias Calles archive, in which I work with under Margie's supervision as well. And this year, I am formulating a presentation on Mexico's nation identity building and Guerrero, the state of Guerrero, as an exception due to its Afro-descendant and indigenous population.
Yeah, thank you, Gigi. So my name is Margie Montañaz. I am an assistant professor and curator of Latin American collections in the Center for Southwest Research in UNM libraries. So that is my name and my title briefly. I don't hold an MLS, but I do hold a PhD in American Studies. So I call myself a cultural studies scholar housed in the libraries, right? Which I think as we get more into this panel, we can kind of unpack that. But, yeah.
Hi everyone, Jonathan Wright. I'm an assistant history curator at the Albuquerque Museum, and you might tell I'm not from here originally. I'm from the UK. Came over here and did a master's at UNM, graduated 3 years ago in just history. So it was a straight history major, but then afterwards thought, you know, how can I use this to move into the museum world, which always fascinated me. And so even though it was medieval, early modern history that I was studying, I ended up getting this job at the Albuquerque Museum through some experiences I got along the way in the museum field. So museum studies here, but then back home as well with some UK courses that worked on being a curator and what that meant. So definitely on the curator side, but I've also worked with UNM on a few different projects. So currently we've got Dictators and the Disappeared exhibition at the Albuquerque Museum, and so that's what's brought me here today. I think is some really interesting work that both UNM has done in the collecting field with all these amazing posters that are on display in the show, but then also I can tell you a bit more about the curator side of what it means to work with the materials in the museum field.
Great, thank you. So I have a few questions for each of you to answer, and then we can just open it up to any questions in our audience. So some of you already touched on this, but how did you guys initially become interested in the work that you do? Where does that interest come from?
Yeah, so is there, do you want to go in the same order? Or
whatever works for you guys. We can have structure, no structure.
So, okay, so I'll start. I think, so the question kind of was like, how did we kind of start this work that we're doing? And for me, it really kind of started organically, and so I've kind of told this story in different settings, but it really is about gaining those experiences, much like you've talked about, and also what Gigi is doing, and that is that as an undergrad, I got an internship with the Office of the State Historian here in Santa Fe, so I worked there for a year as an intern. They were working on, at that point, it was like the legacy of letters, collecting archival letters and trying to create this database. It was really on the cusp of like digital humanities. I worked under then state historian Dr. Esteban Raed Galvez. And then as I progressed through my studies, I was also a graduate fellow at the CSWR. I was the Historical Manuscripts Fellow. And so what happened with me organically is that I started getting exposed to these different experiences and just taking advantage of them, right? Not really knowing what they are, but kind of looking at them. And really what I started doing, as a lot of us do in graduate school, is questioning like, what is this field, right? And how does it exist outside of just my thesis or my dissertation? How are we getting these materials? How do we access them? How do we disseminate them? How do we preserve them? Who's being represented? How are we cataloging them? And so these questions kind of raised themselves as I was doing this work, documenting the work and writing this work. So eventually I finally finished the PhD, and luckily there is CLEAR, which stands for the Council on Library and Information Resources, and one of their missions through their postdoctoral program is to place humanities PhDs in libraries and cultural institutions. Because without the MLS, you need that exposure, you need that experience. And so I guess that's how I started in this position, and then in the field rather, and then it led to this position.
Yeah, well, my experience is quite a bit shorter, but how I started working in the archives here at UNM was through the graduate assistantship. I was very fortunate to be oriented towards this position and diving into it. Margie was such a great supervisor that helped me get a hang of things. But my first experience, period, with archives was when I was doing research in UCLA for looking into microfiche about the Justice for Janitors movement, which I was doing my research on, and that first experience was super daunting to me. I was suddenly presented with this huge machine that I'm supposed to know how to precisely maneuver, and so when I saw that, I was able to dive again into that experience here. It was such a big relief, and it really opened so many new windows to me in being less daunted by all of these structures. There's so many materials in libraries, and it's a beautiful world that I've been able to expose myself to. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to build on what you're saying. Actually, that's such a good point, and something that you all, no matter what you end up doing, museum, library, archive, anything, even outside of anything to do with that, is being open to not necessarily feeling you have to be comfortable with everything that you're being asked to do immediately. That's going to be a lot of the experience. I'm sure all three of us can relate to that moment of being put in front of something, going, I've got to become an expert in this pretty quick. That's what I'm expected to do. I was a little lucky in a sense because I kept stumbling into these museum opportunities when they were being offered. So luck in one sense, I was in the right place at the right time to work. I started off very young. I think I was too young to do this, maybe 13, 14. I was put in the basement of Durham Light Infantry Museum in the northeast of England and given these shards of glass and told, work out what they are, do some research. And I think it took me, again, far too long, 2 months to realise that they were shards from Ypres Cathedral in Belgium, which had been bombed in the First World War. And so this person who had just donated some glass because they were nice coloured, stained glass, it ended up being this massive historical thing. I was like, oh my goodness, okay, I did that, I found out. So that's a good, again, that started me off because you have to find your passion in this too, I'll say as well. It's balancing both knowing that you're going to be an expert in some things and being open to others with, leaning into some things that you end up finding you enjoy. So I enjoyed that, finding our process of that. And then so later on when I was going into an undergrad in Leeds in England, there was a course that ended up being museum studies equivalent that I know we have here, there was the equivalent over there. And you ended up with the choice of either curating your own exhibit or co-curating with a partner, or working in an archive. And I said, okay, I've done a little bit of archive work before, done collections, so let's do this curator thing. And we ended up in a library doing what I think ended up being called sweepiana, so looking at chimney sweeps in Victorian England. It's very quaint and classic and stereotypical, I guess. But, and then comparing it to the poetry of the time, so how were these chimney sweeps depicted, how were they in your life? And again, that was something I had no idea going into the year I was going to enjoy, but you just throw yourself at it, because any kind of experience like that ends up being something you'll learn from. And so equally coming out here for the Masters, kept an eye out for museum studies opportunities, and I think at the end of, after I graduated, I thought, oh goodness, I think I need a job now, whoops. And I didn't know what to do, because I didn't grow up here, I didn't know all the museums necessarily, all the archives, everything, and hadn't experienced a lot with CSWR, which again is a regret, because it's such a fantastic resource. But I ended up reaching out to every single place, and it was just a very bland, generic email saying, hi, I've got some experience, I'm really interested in this. What opportunities do you have? What positions are available? This kind of thing. And I think I got maybe 3 responses out of, maybe 20, 25 reach outs. But one of them was the Albuquerque Museum saying, it seems you've applied to, work with the volunteers and do docent or guide training. Because you have some experience, we're passing you on to the history team. They're looking for an assistant curator. You have some experience, you can interview with them. And that was how I got this. So I didn't even apply for the job I ended up getting. It's just, you've got to do the reaching out. That will be my initial advice. I'm sure we'll go into, how to get these jobs. But reach out, always talk to the folks who are there, the curators, the archivists, the librarians, and just show interest. I think that's the main thing. I've already talked too long, but that's a long story. Mm-hmm.
So the second question is, in what ways does the work that you do relate to either Latin American studies or international studies?
I can lead on this one. I mentioned the Dictators and Disappeared show. The subtitle for that is Democracy Lost and Restored, which is the focus of it. So we're not only looking at Pinochet, all these 70s and 80s dictators that were in the Southern Cone, but also the responses to that. So what did folks come up with creatively through posters, through arpilleras, through these special mediums to say we don't agree with this and we're trying to get our voice out to the world. So that's been my second delving into the Southern Cone. I was lucky enough to go on a trip to Ecuador in the gap year between universities that I did, and ended up studying in the ministry there for some of the historical programs they have going on, which is a lot of looking at the past. So Chile is doing a lot of this. They have a museum that's dedicated to memory, and what does that mean? What are we holding on to? What are we not? What do we need to move on from? And so this idea of what's happening in South America really interested me. And so when this show came up, I thought, oh my goodness, we've got to do it. We've got to do it. So working with UNM to blow all of the posters from the CSWR collection was great. And we worked with Russ Davidson, who's now a curator emeritus, but obviously has been tied to CSWR for a while. So that's been my main international focus, but coming from England, I can't help but hold on to some of those historical interests too. My paper, although I'm now working in a museum that is not going to go close to any of this, was on recusancy, which is kind of being a different religion in a country that is trying to go down one religious path. So in England, that was maybe being a Protestant in Catholic rule, or vice versa, a Catholic and Protestant rule, and what did the music scene look like. So trying to weave that into modern American history has been hard, but I'm going to do it. I've got a show that's coming up about maps that's going to be taking what did folks traveling from Europe to America in the 1600s, 1700s, what did they bring with them and implement, so stereotypes and things on these maps, on the marginalia. But then again, I just wanted to say that to show you that you can have all your interests and you should always keep them, keep what you're interested in. There will always be an opportunity to work with that, because at the Albuquerque Museum we have this fantastic collection of maps, and so jump on those opportunities too. In terms of keeping up to date with everything else, I think the news is a great way to always hone in on these international interests and stay sort of broadly interested. But I think even the fact that you guys are here, working with the Latin American Institute, it's a great opportunity to look further than just the physical horizons you have here.
Thanks. So I want to see some of the other questions, just to make sure that I don't kind of overlap too. So the way that the work that I'm doing kind of overlaps with Latin American studies or international studies, and I think that, so my position specifically as the curator of Latin American and U.S. Latinx collections, it overlaps directly because I am responsible for building those collections. So I think for those that are probably interested in museums, different areas of cultural institutions, or even academic libraries, there's no way to get around, I think, the importance of this subject, MA or PhD, depending on your track, because when I was doing this initial work, right, as just a graduate fellow and an intern, there's so much that's lost, and it's going to rest on all of us with that deep subject knowledge to be able to understand which collections are important, right? What's missing, what's not missing, what's represented, and also kind of be able to see in the future, right? Is these materials, is there research value in this? What history is this preserving or sharing? And so even just in conversations with Gigi, I would say, oh, I just bought another collection, or we have something else, or I'm adding to a collection. And especially if bridging these fields, I think that coming in with an area studies background is priceless, right? It's really, really important to be able to do that work.
I agree. I'm going to echo what both of you have said a bit, because in the center of my studies, I focus on decoloniality, Latin American decolonial studies. And so me being able to have access, or being able to even see the collections that are stored in this one library I work at. When on this campus there are like 5 libraries alone, I'm always just like amazed by the materials that are there, how people are remembered, why, and why was this piece like saved? What are the significance in these items that may be material or not that we carry forth? How people are remembered, and especially now that we're seeing what our Palestinian siblings are facing, memory holds it holds such great value, you know. And so I think my studies have been greatly impacted by my work, given the fact that that you get to see into this memory making and how it impacts not only one field, but it's a system. It's like an academic, at least academic ecology, you know, or ecosystem, where one thing resonates somewhere else, and it's all contributing to what? So very a little bit more philosophical edge, but like that's how I've been analyzing or like reflecting on my times working here in the library, more than anything memory, and what are we going to do?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of also say something along those lines is that, so one of the philosophies, my own philosophy that kind of drives this work is this idea that collections are culture, right? And so there's not this work that we're doing in libraries or museums, there's not separating them, right? Once we kind of realize that, no, this is culture, it's not just a representative, it takes on kind of a different meaning and actually I think a different responsibility.
And that makes sense in the museum setting too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the Albuquerque Museum, you've got all these collections, huge, varied sort of sources of where they came from, which communities they talk about, but just having the ability to have certain skills to enable you to, you know, look through and maybe sort through certain collections and all these things. Like this is what you're saying, you know, if you have that area-specific background and experience researching, I think it doesn't matter what you've researched, you understand then what a collection is and what it can mean to the communities around and how you can spread the messages of what's in there, because they're not there to be kept hidden.
Right.
You know, it's
Yeah.
it is a resource in its own way.
Okay, thank you. So our third question, how can undergraduate or graduate students interested in these fields gain exposure? Do you know of any volunteer work opportunities either on campus in Albuquerque or outside of this area?
So I would say like one outside of, so I'll answer kind of just briefly, right? I don't know of any volunteer work right off the bat. I do know that the Center for Southwest Research does have fellows that they make a call out for to hire graduate fellows, and so that usually happens late spring for the following year. So I could probably share that link, and so you would want to just kind of keep looking, right, for those positions. So that's the kind of basic answer. I think the nuanced answer on how to gain exposure is really looking at that exposure that already exists, but learning how to talk about it, how to narrate that story, right? And so, so it's that, and then it's also understanding that this field of library science and museum studies is a field. It is a field, it is an academic field with their own disciplines. So just kind of polishing up on some of that, but understanding how to talk about what you're doing in those terms. So just here, right, at the LAII, oh, we're making an afad. I heard you talking about the Dia de los Muertos. Is there research that's going on to archival? Understanding that in itself, in which way is that putting on an exhibit, curating an exhibit, right? You're having to find a theme, pull collections, narrate a story, and so to talk about it. And so I share this with Gigi and my other fellows too, about it's very easy to get caught up, especially during graduate school, of, okay, this is just something I'm doing to supplement my courses. And that's true in a lot of sense, but if you can spend some time of really thinking about how to talk about that, it would go a long way, because I didn't think about that. It came to me after so many years, but if someone's saying, this is what you're doing, right? You're already doing this, talk about it. Also, in some ways, this is premature, but later on this semester, we're working on curating an exhibit, right? And in the CSW Waters Room titled Pedacitos de Resistencia. And so that is another skill, another experience that Gigi then can write about. So it's not only writing the metadata, we haven't even touched on the post-custodial collections, but exhibit work, right? And so it really is an exercise in narrating that story.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that too, because I think as well, jumping on anything that you see, like you were saying, is there going to be something to do with that? Offering help at a voluntary level it's a hard thing to say, but I think just reaching out, it can be a completely blind email to an info@ email address. Someone's going to read it, they'll hear that you're interested, and they may just forward it on to that interested party that has the job that you didn't even know was available. So I can tell you, I mentioned it earlier, that was how I got this current position, but there's other ways too to keep eyes open, I would say, at all times of the year too. It's not like there's certain moments it's going to be best. If you're currently enrolled, and taking classes, it's still the time you could reach out and say, even if it's a couple hours a week, could I come down and help you sift through some of the collections in the basement, that kind of thing. At a museum, at a library, it could be, filling in for those hours, being on call. And all of these things, you're talking to folks who probably do have a lot of experience in that field and can tell you more about, if you became full-time, here's what you'd be doing, and that kind of thing. So I know even just from the museum, if you were to reach out, in the history department, there's 2 voluntary positions that are waiting to be filled. We have 2 UNM students that are paid, I think it's 10 hours a week only, so again, it's not full-time, it would be to supplement studies, but now they're working on our permanent exhibition and doing a demographic analysis. So they're looking at what stories are being told and what aren't. It's working with the objects, it's doing your own research, it's updating our own database of TMS, and so you're learning how to use museum databases all at the same time, all for 10 hours a week, and you're being paid to do it. So I don't think either of those 2 who did it again, they didn't look for an email, they didn't have Indeed.com, notifications turned on, which you should do for sure. Turn on curator or archivist or whatever search term you're interested in. But again, they just did that by reaching out blindly and saying, hey, I'm interested in the museum world, what can I do? Do you have any positions? I'll also say, even if there isn't a position open, the name will be held. Your resume or whatever you send in with that application will be held, and I know the head curator will reach out again kind of blindly back and say, we actually have an opening, I don't know if you've taken on something since you reached out. But I think the main thing I'd like you guys to take away, at least from my own experience, is to just not be afraid to do that reaching out. That feels like I'm reaching into the abyss, I'm going to get 1 reply out of 20, but that's okay, that 1 might be something that you end up being super interested in and can end up being a career. So that's my perspective at least.
I'm also going to double down on the reaching out. I was thinking reaching out to your community, again, it's like an ecosystem. We're all connected to one another, and I know that me, myself, with the experience that I've had with these almost 2 years, I would love to share my experiences, and to if someone's passionate about it, please reach out to me. And also here at UNM at least, there's a directory for the library systems where you can maybe look up, see someone that has a career that you'd really be interested in hearing more about. Email them. Maybe 1 email will get answered out of 20, but it's that 1 that you need. As well as look out for mentorship programs. I know that La Raza does mentorship system, as well as I saw one earlier this semester around the library. I forgot who was running it, but look out for those mentorship programs, because there are people who are so excited to help you develop your professional career, your other activities, and you just gotta reach out and find the community.
There may even be courses on campus in departments you didn't expect. I mean, yes, museum studies for museums, archives, libraries, that kind of thing. But even in the history department, I know they're doing professionalization workshops, and you don't have to be a historian or in the department to go to those and to be part of that class. So again, keeping eyes open as to if there's a class this semester that would set you up with loading other professionals who could do things like this on a more personal one-on-one basis, work on resumes, things like that. But then also equally, you never know. You again, at museum studies program, I know if you take this course, you can get a certification, and then after the year or 2 of doing that, you have something tangible to when you're applying, saying, well, I've got this experience already. Hopefully, this will set me apart from the other candidates if it's a job they're applying for.
One other, what was the question? to gain exposure, one other thing that I think is really important to, in addition to crafting how you write about these experiences, is don't shy away from all of the tech knowledge that you bring. And so more and more to understand the shape of the field is also understanding that more and more there's a digital presence, right? And so if you're talking about this physical Day of the Dead experience, well, is someone advertising on Twitter, right? Is there a digital exhibit to correspond with that? And so that is something that I think a lot of times we take for granted, like, oh yes, of course, but those are skills. Those are skills, and more and more that is going to also add lines to your portfolio, right? And so it really is just kind of making visible all of those invisible skills you already bring to the field as area studies students.
So this final question is very related to the last question, but just what advice do you have in general for students interested in these fields with a background in Latin American studies or international studies?
The first thing I'd say is maybe something I haven't looked into as much as I'd like to, but there are probably international opportunities that, again, you might not know that links to this digital age you're talking about. You could feasibly work with, you know, a university or a library or some kind of, you know, museum in somewhere like Chile. You don't know. I would, again, just keep eyes open, and if there are international opportunities, don't shun them down just because you won't be there in person. With the COVID years, I mean, I'm sure that's opened up an enormous amount of online jobs where, you know, not only would you be kind of maybe choosing your own hours, but you'd also be working out, you know, how that looks and how they can benefit from maybe your experience while the collection is there. For example, I'm sure they have a database that maybe needs a little sifting through, and you could be doing that from afar. So being able to be remote is something that I, again, haven't looked into a whole lot, but I know is out there. And should be something you shouldn't shy away from too, because especially at the voluntary level, if it's someone who's not going to be hands-on, doesn't need a computer in the space, being able to offer your assistance from afar, I think can be something that, again, maybe even the museums, archives don't even know they need, and you could help them with.
Yeah, I think that one thing I will say for those kind of interested in maybe more of the academic archive and library route is that oftentimes for the positions as like maybe a curator here at UNM, for example, is that they do require then an MLS or a PhD, right? Coupled with that experience. So as you guys are going through this program or any of your programs, it would be to find experiences, find opportunities where you can kind of gain that field experience, whether it's libraries and archives or, you know, helping the NHCC or the Barelas Community Center with some kinds of these activities. And that, I think, is the most important, is to be able to balance the academic degrees that we're working with that practical field experience is probably the most important, I would say.
I did mention a little bit my first diving into library studies or doing research with archives, and so my first advice would be, don't be daunted. No, like it's we're right now living. I think of it in the way that right now we're living in the age of interdisciplinary studies. So like if you're in one thing, don't be afraid to get messy. Try things out. Of course, please get the guidance you need to make sure that things work out and that you will get your thesis approved. But take advantage of the resources that you have. Yeah, seeking guidance and relying on community would be the best advice I can give.
So we have Luis here. Can you just join the panel and
Hello.
share
Sorry,
some of
my
your
phone. I don't
experience?
remember now. Sorry. Very sorry. Nice to meet you.
So I was going to open it up to questions, but Luis, if you wanted to introduce yourself and your experience.
Very quickly.
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
yeah, great. Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Sorry again, my fault. But good afternoon, and thanks to the organizer for having me here today. My name is Luis Martinez. I am from Mexico City. I am archaeology, but I study in the National School of Anthropology and History in Mexico City, and I have a master's degree in philosophy of science in the University of Guadalajara City, Mexico. I have broad experience studying and working in the West and Northwest in Mexico. And my last job was in the Archaeological Site Teotihuacan. In my work in archaeology, it's common to teach training students and give broad explanation about the progress of all research to student, visitor, or community. In the excavation field, there is always something new or exciting to discover, which require explanation beyond the common knowledge. For me, these sites are an open field museums. But in 2017, me and my wife moved to Chicago and switched gears and worked at the General Consulate of Mexico in Chicago in the documentation department. Now I am really happy to be in New Mexico and I am now volunteering in the Maxwell Museum. It is fascinating going back to archaeology. Within the museum, we support in the Maxwell Museum, I support all the crew, support the packing and update the inventories of the different collections within the museum, and I have broad experience in the classification of archaeological material, and I specialize in the study of ceramic and pottery. Recently, I have been supporting the identification and classification of the Mesoamerican pottery in the museum. Thank you. I got a question. Thank you, panel, for sharing your thoughts. I know Margie, we work together. She has supported me in different stuff. So my question is, what would be the skill set for people moving from master's program into the curator career, knowing that it's a transdisciplinary, knowing that every institution has their own protocols and rules for working in museums or libraries, and knowing that out there beyond off-campus world market, it differs. So what do you think is the substance of having the curator to have knowledge of?
So I would say that, in my opinion, I think it's really important to understand what happens between getting a collection and before it's discoverable and accessible,
Right.
because that's where we come in, right? So it's this idea of understanding that this large collection, that all of these books condensed down to like 5 subject terms, metadata, right? And so this is the ways, the algorithms, in other words, are like all of the little machines in the background that when all of us are doing research, it's pulling up that archival collection, and to understand the role that metadata plays in the discovery of this stuff, right? And so I think that coming to work in libraries with a PhD and not an MLS, I do think that by those in the library science field, which I was not a part of, there is this disconnect that they think about, like, well, just because you're a researcher doesn't mean you can do that, this work. And so it's really not taking that for granted and understanding that there are these things that I've learned right through experiences and kind of on the job, is that there is this other layer that happens. Right, and so that is understanding the processing, right, that Gigi has helped with, and rehousing the boxes, and while the theoretical is something that I get very excited about, and it's actually what sustains me in this work that I do, there's also this kind of mundane activities, this skill set that is very specific to an academic library and archive that I think one would need.
Yeah, and just to build on that too, I'd say there's ways you could even get experience in this before you get that job that is, going to expect you to kind of know what a database is, how to input and take from. So in the museum field, there's a couple of different programs. There's TMS, or the museum system, which is, again, it can be used for anything, but it's mainly a program to store your collections digitally so that everyone can access it who works at that location. It's very specific and it's very expensive if you want to get your own, version of it. So I would recommend some experience in Past Perfect. I think 5 is a free one you can get, and that, although you're not working at a museum that has a collection to work on, it'll teach you what it means to work your way around a database and what the fields are, and this metadata that you're talking about. And again, I think it is something that a lot of people applying for jobs at museums don't really get. They'll say, oh, well, I've been writing and researching for years and years, I should get this, right? There's a lot of the in-betweens that I think you can get any kind of experience. That would be great. And the only other thing I'd say for the next step after that is, knowing that you have this research and writing experience, is being able to translate that in a public way. So academic writing is obviously so different to writing for the general public. I think we at the museum, it's getting lower and lower, and that's kind of sad in its own way, but the reading age we have to assume is, I think, maybe grade 6 or 7. And so that's obviously very different when you're dealing with difficult, theoretical at times, subjects, and how do you condense this information from this, maybe an example of pottery or something, how do you condense that to something that's going to be readable for all ages? And that's a skill, again, I think you just get by doing. I think, if you can get some experience writing for the public, even if it's social media, if it's podcasting, I'm just trying to think of any kind of way to, again, appeal to public audiences with maybe something that's really important academically for you. There's a way to tie those academic and public fields together before you go for that job that requires it.
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend also, back to a point that you made earlier, but also that you mentioned, courses that are available. So for example, in the way that I'm taking a communications course that I did not expect to take, and it's informing me so much on how to write, with what you talked about writing, to a public about critical archives, and it's something that I did not expect to dive into in this communications course, but it's definitely informing me greatly. As well as there are trainings that do go on within CSWR, and now that I know you're interested, I would love to pass you information on what the trainings are when, because we've got a training on the digital repository, uploading, or how what uploading means, how you do it, as well as writing text, preservation workshops, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions?
The times when I was graduating from my PhD program, and there was a crisis. I think there still is a job crisis in academia. So many of my colleagues doing area studies, Eastern Europe, Africa, etc., they ended up in jobs in museums and library, and in having the PhD in that field helped them a lot. And I've never had conversations with them, but I wonder if the technical metadata, it's something that you can pick up on the job, on the fly, because I have so many friends that didn't have a certificate in museum studies or a library science degree, and yet they ended up getting the jobs because the museums was very specific about regional studies, and I think knowing the language of that field, of that area, and being have this deep knowledge of the region helped them a lot to get a job.
Yeah.
But I always wonder, how do they deal with, now that you mentioned all the metadata?
Yeah. So it might, depending on our audience, right? I think we have a different kind of more sympathetic audience here, is that I actually agree. And so I do think that while one can take a course on metadata, I learned it on the job, right? And so I think, you're not going to go take a class on the history of the borderlands for 16 weeks and come back as an expert and be able to cure this. So I do think that there is value in an area expertise, without a doubt, to know that it exists and to talk about it, right? And so that would be my advice, is that you don't have to know about it, you don't have to know how that you do it, you don't have to say oh, I did the metadata for this collection. but you have to know that it exists and what role it's going to play in that job. So that's, yeah.
Is paying attention to database records when you're doing your own research for a paper and looking at the fields and trying to figure out what they're for, is that a step?
Yeah, that's absolutely a step. And we've, the library, especially the center, I mean, we've had patrons where I think people are knowing that, and that is exactly to understand what they're there, the records, what they've come back to it and say like, wait a minute, this is categorized and this is not that, or this is not what, you know, and so also understanding, and this is kind of more the theoretical, but that those fields are fluid, right? There's that, you can change, we can go in and adjust them, and like also understanding that weaving between this metadata and how it could change and adjust, and right, and so yeah, right? Knowing how those work, and so it's not just to be like, do I want to include this in my annotated bib? No, right? But to understand, right? And so maybe that's one thing, it's not the topic of the question, but maybe assignments, right? So instead of just the annotated bib, it could be like, what are those subject areas? Which ones do you recommend? Do they, right? And so kind of really getting students to think critically, engaging critically with that back end might be really an interesting way.
And I always have students help each other on keywords because they'll come up with nothing in a search, and it's because they're not thinking in the way that the people who develop the metadata think.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going through something like that even at the Albuquerque Museum now with the history permanent exhibit, which is, you know, it was great when it came up, but even, 10 years later now, we're having to really assess the terms that we use, the classifications especially. So thinking about the metadata, when people search for an object, are they going, if it's termed or deemed a communication object, who's going to search for that and what are they going to find from it? So now we're going through this process of working out what's a better, label to put for those people who are searching. And I think even maybe in the 10 years you can see increased people online and folks who are using e-museums and databases like that to find resources differently to going in person. So you kind of need to follow that trend too. And so kind of like what you were saying, I don't think it's necessarily you need a certificate to prove you've done anything, just being aware of it as you're doing it.
Fortifications, colonial fortifications in frontera, North American borders and the Caribbean. And most of what you have said have resonated in terms that probably I'm not doing a full career as curator, despite the fact that I envision most of that during that pathway. But what I'm noticing is how to transfer much of what I learned as an apprentice curator and moving toward a different setting. For instance, like while curating, you develop really detail-oriented skills. You need to pay attention. You become very taxonomic. You become very picky on your data, protective. You develop this relationship with your data. You mentioned there in saying, make it speak your data, but to make it speak, you need to have a report. A report will develop with that data. So, like anyway, you say, curation is not just a job or on the environment to learn stuff, but you become a skill. Very interesting one that you build culture with that. So, I appreciate what you have said. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. And I would even maybe add to that too, just to say that, curation, I like that idea that it's not a thing, it's not a job, it's a process too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, because I think...
It's organic, as you said.
Yeah, and I think that can really help when you're thinking about the transferable skills, what can you take forward through a career, and if you're doing it for a bit and moving on to something else. Curation can include everything. It includes the creating ideas stage where you're from nothing pulling something that has to become something. Then it's the data mining essentially. It's what do we have in the collection. It's having the making those mental connections to say I think this one will work with this, and maybe this collection could match that, and we can make a story out of both of these. And that's very similar to essay writing. It's you have nothing, now you have a title, then you have to draw everything into the main body and through these thesis statements and points throughout. I think the curation is a very physical representation of that, because you have a very tangible end product that people see either online or in
Material
person.
culture, and you just mentioned something at the beginning, you're confronted with material, just like sometimes you don't understand, you don't know that. What the hell doing with this? But then it starts emerging, popping out.
Yeah, so, and then knowing that you can take every single step of that and apply it to everything else. You know, the creative stage could be for creative writing, you know, it could be social media posting, anything. Equally, proposal writing and grant writing, all these things, you might think, how is it related? Because it's not the same physical output, but you're still using data, you're still creating your own ideas, it can all be transferable.
I had a question for you, Luis. Is there something you could tell us that you found is a difference in that curating between your work at the Maxwell and your work at the INA? Like what's cultural, a different approach culturally to curating?
Yes, for example, you say, it's difficult because in this moment the museum has a big collection to the Mesoamerican pottery, but don't have any, archaeology department don't have any expert in Mesoamerica or South America too. I think one professor works in Guatemala or central area of Maya, but any have experience about the Mesoamerican cultures, but all the objects are for donors and don't have any context, and any archaeological context. Archaeologists, we need the context, not the piece. But obviously, my work is identify the vessel, or is a plate, or is a bowl, is fake, is not fake, is pre-Hispanic, is modern, is what area, is not Mexico, is not the same west of Mexico, north of Mexico, northwest of Mexico, center. If the center is not the same, the Aztec, Toltecs, Tlaxcala towns. And obviously, in my experience in National Institute of Anthropology, have two schools: the School of Anthropology and History and the School of the Museums, Museography, museum. And we are different people, we are different partners, because we always work in the museum. In my case, an archaeologist, we have only the word. You are an archaeologist, you work in the field. You don't have experience in the museum. In database museum, the lights, the speech, the crystals, whatever. In contrary, the museographers don't have experience about the piece in the excavation, you know. But, you need more careful about the bowl. No, it's my job. No. Because I need to take a picture, I need to make it 3 days to excavate in this, because it's very difficult. No, it's broken now. No, it's my job. You know, it's a fighting, eternal fighting in the experts. I think it is the same here, maybe, with the archaeologists and museographers.
It is, and that can even go to history and art, having differences in when does art become history? Is it about the person who made it? Is it about the object?
I was thinking there's an art historian who does Mesoamerican. So why isn't she part of the team or engaged as well?
Yeah, obviously, Mesoamerican history is a long period of time.
Yeah.
The most common history is the Olmecs, is a linear history, you know. Olmecs and the Bay of Mexico cultures, the big side Cuicuilco, and other cultures in the Zapotec and Mayans, different Mayans, the highlands and lowlands, the West Mexico cultures. For example, the west of Mexico, in Mexico don't have any knowledge about the names of the groups, language, the real name of the sites, because the Spanish conquistadors traveled to north, west, southwest too, and using the name with the Aztec or Tlaxcalteca people say.
Yeah.
Albuquerque, no, New Mexico, California, and the other state, no, Louisiana, for example, is French,
Yeah.
French name. It's too hard work about the history in a long time, but have a good periods. The Latin voices, Native American voices,
Okay.
I think work it together, the museum and the specialists
yeah.
with the different
Mhm.
Native American people
Right.
and make the exposition about.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay, this piece is from whatever professor, but
Mhm.
it's for my people now.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
but it's for my land,
Right.
for my ancestors.
Yeah, yeah, and so one thing along that line too, which is important about that post-custodial, is that the archivo in Mexico City is writing the metadata, and we just translate it. So we're not assigning what's important and how to catalog it. So I think that is another way, if you're thinking about experiences and working with communities as far as
Yeah.
how do you guys want to be represented, right? And kind of taking that back to adjust these records these are all, I mean, there's a lot on the horizon, and I think it's probably about time.
I'm guessing that everyone in this room is aware of the international studies. Their lecture series this fall is about museums and decolonization, but if you're not aware, where would we get, is it on our, do we have links on our website?
We've been putting on the
It's on the
It's
digest.
in the digest.
There is something coming up about the Newberry Consortium. Is a professor from history, Dr. Stout, is presenting a new project on the Newberry and the Native American collections in the Southwest.
In
And
Chicago.
they are presenting in water
Okay.
coolers. That's it, but I don't know when it's happening. So next week.
Great. I know we have some QR codes if you guys would be able to fill those out and give us some feedback. But thank you so much to our panelists for being here and taking the time.